It was a warm Saturday afternoon, and the aroma of sizzling spices and grilled perfection wafted through the streets. Elijah, a young, talented black chef, worked diligently in the kitchen of a trendy downtown restaurant. Every dish he created was a masterpiece, a fusion of flavors inspired by his southern roots and his dream of one day opening his own restaurant. The customers adored him, the staff admired him, and his boss, Mr. Williams, had taken him under his wing like a proud mentor. Elijah's culinary skills had made the restaurant a local sensation. Outside the restaurant, a woman named Karen, yes, her name was actually Karen, stood glaring through the large glass windows. She was dressed in an immaculate beige outfit, clutching her designer handbag tightly. Her nose wrinkled in disapproval as she observed Elijah moving with precision and confidence in the open kitchen. Karen had recently moved to the neighborhood, and she had an eye for anything, or anyone, she deemed out of place. Today, Elijah was her target. She couldn't quite explain it, but something about seeing him in charge irked her. Maybe it was his infectious smile as he chatted with customers, or perhaps it was the way he carried himself, unapologetically proud of who he was. She stepped inside, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor, and approached the host's stand with a frown. "Excuse me," Karen said in a tone that carried a blend of entitlement and suspicion. "I'd like to speak to the manager, immediately." The young host, caught off guard by her abruptness, stammered, the manager isn't here at the moment. Can I help you with something?" Karen's eyes narrowed. "I'll wait. This is important." Meanwhile, Elijah continued plating his latest creation, oblivious to the storm brewing just a few feet away. Karen's impatience grew as she watched him, her annoyance boiling over. Finally, she pulled out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen as she dialed a number. "Hello, police?" Karen's voice was loud enough for several diners to hear, causing a hush to fall over the bustling restaurant. "Yes, I'd like to report suspicious activity. There's a man here. I don't think he works here. He's pretending to be a chef, and he's making everyone uncomfortable." Elijah, hearing the commotion, turned toward the entrance. His brows furrowed in confusion as he saw Karen glaring at him while speaking into her phone. The staff exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to do. Some diners whispered among themselves, their expressions a mix of shock and disbelief. Karen smirked as she hung up, clearly satisfied with herself. "Don't worry," she announced to no one in particular. "I'm just making sure this place is safe for everyone." Elijah took a deep breath, setting down his utensils. He didn't want to escalate the situation, but he also refused to shrink under her baseless accusations. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm and steady, "I'm the sous chef here. If you have any concerns, I'd be happy to address them." Karen's expression turned icy. "Oh, I'm sure you'd say that," she replied, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "But we'll let the authorities decide." Minutes later, the sound of sirens approached, and a wave of unease spread through the restaurant. Elijah stood his ground, his heart pounding but his face composed. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but the weight of countless similar stories hung heavy in his mind. As the officers entered, Karen stepped forward eagerly. "Thank goodness you're here. That man," she pointed at Elijah, "is causing trouble. He doesn't belong here." Before the officers could respond, the restaurant's glass door swung open once again. A tall figure stepped inside, radiating authority. The room fell silent. All eyes shifting between Karen, the restaurant owner, and Mr. Williams. Alone. Elijah exhaled slowly, his gaze meeting his boss's. There was no need for words. Mr. Williams's expression said it all. He was here to set things right. Mr. Williams was a man who commanded attention without needing to raise his voice. In his tailored suit and with his calm, yet firm demeanor, he carried an air of quiet authority. His arrival was enough to make the police officers pause, sensing that they were stepping into something more complicated than the phone call had suggested. Karen, however, didn't flinch. If anything, she seemed emboldened by her perceived victory. She turned to Mr. Williams with a triumphant smirk, ready to present her version of the story. "Oh good, you must be the manager," she said, her voice dripping with false politeness. "I've already called the police. This man," she gestured toward Elijah, has been acting suspiciously, and I wasn't about to let it go unchecked. I'm just looking out for your business, you see." Mr. Williams didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked at Elijah, whose jaw was clenched but who still maintained his composure. Then, he turned to Karen with a calm expression, though there was a glint in his eyes that hinted at his growing irritation. "I appreciate your concern, ma'am," Mr. Williams said, his voice steady. "But I'd like to understand exactly what makes you think my sous chef here is suspicious." Karen blinked, clearly caught off guard by the word *sus, chef * for a moment, she faltered, but then her indignation resurfaced. "Well," she began, "he doesn't seem very professional. And the way he was moving around back there, it just didn't look right. I mean, you'd think someone in his position would. Well, never mind. I just had a bad feeling about him." One of the police officers stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable with the tension in the room. "Sir," he said, addressing Mr. Williams, "we received a call about suspicious activity. Can you confirm this man is an employee here?" Mr. Williams smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Not just an employee," he said, his voice carrying a subtle but unmistakable pride. "Elijah is my sous chef, and one of the most talented individuals I've had the pleasure of working with. This restaurant wouldn't be what it is today without him." The officer nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Understood, sir. If that's the case, we don't want to cause any trouble. It sounds like there's been a misunderstanding." But Karen wasn't ready to back down. "A misunderstanding?" she exclaimed, her voice rising. "Are you seriously going to ignore what I've told you? I saw what I saw." Elijah finally spoke, his voice calm but resolute. "And what exactly did you see, ma'am?" "Me working hard? Me doing my job. Because I don't think you'd have called the police if someone else had been in my place." The room fell silent again. Karen's face flushed, but she quickly masked her embarrassment with a haughty laugh. "Oh, don't try to make this about race," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "I was just trying to protect the customers." "Protect them from what?" Mr. Williams asked sharply, his tone finally betraying a hint of the anger he had been holding back. "From a man doing his job? From someone who has earned his position through talent and hard work? Or was it just because he doesn't look the way you think a chef should look?" Karen opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She glanced around the room, realizing that the diners and staff were all watching her, their expressions ranging from disapproval to outright anger. The murmurs of discontent grew louder, and for the first time, Karen looked genuinely uncomfortable. As the tension in the room thickened, one of the police officers cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said, his tone firm but professional, "it doesn't seem like there's any real issue here. We'll have to ask you to let it go." Karen's face turned red, but she forced a tight smile. "Fine," she said through gritted teeth, "but don't say I didn't warn you when something goes wrong." With that, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the restaurant, her heels clicking loudly against the floor. The door swung shut behind her, and a collective sigh of relief swept through the room. But Elijah wasn't relieved. He stood there, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his mind racing with a mix of anger, frustration, and exhaustion. This wasn't the first time he'd been judged unfairly, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. Mr. Williams stepped closer to him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," he said quietly. "You didn't deserve any of it." Elijah nodded, but he didn't trust himself to speak. His chest felt tight, and he needed a moment to process everything that had just happened. The customers, meanwhile, began clapping, softly at first, then louder. Elijah looked up, surprised as the applause grew. Some of the diners stood up, offering words of encouragement. "You're amazing, Chef Elijah. Don't let her get to you. Your food is the reason we come here." The unexpected support warmed Elijah's heart, though it didn't completely erase the sting of Karen's actions. He managed a small smile and nodded in gratitude, but the weight of the incident still lingered. As the police officers left, Mr. Williams addressed the room. "Thank you all for your understanding," he said. "I can assure you that this restaurant values every single member of our team, and we will not tolerate any form of discrimination or disrespect." The diners cheered in response, and slowly, the restaurant returned to its usual rhythm. The staff got back to work, the customers resumed their meals, and the hum of conversation filled the air once again. But for Elijah, the day was far from over. He retreated to the back of the kitchen, needing a moment to himself. As he leaned against the counter, his mind replayed the events over and over. The words Karen had used, the assumptions she had made, the way she had tried to strip him of his dignity. All of it hit him harder than he cared to admit. Mr. Williams found him there a few minutes later. "Elijah," he said gently, "you did nothing wrong. Don't let her ignorance overshadow everything you've accomplished." Elijah nodded again, but his thoughts remained heavy. "It's just frustrating," he admitted. "No matter how hard I work, no matter what I achieve, people like her will always see me as less than." Mr. Williams frowned, his jaw tightening. "Then we'll prove them wrong," he said firmly. "Not for her, or anyone like her, but for you. You've earned your place here, Elijah, and nothing can take that away." Elijah looked up at his boss, the weight on his chest lifting just a little. He wasn't sure what the future held, but in that moment, he felt a renewed determination to keep going, to keep proving himself, not to people like Karen, but to himself and the people who believed in him. As he straightened up and returned to his station, a thought crossed his mind. This was just one chapter in his story, and he wasn't about to let someone else write the ending. As the evening settled in, the restaurant's atmosphere shifted. The chatter of satisfied customers filled the space, and the kitchen buzzed with activity. Elijah, though focused on his tasks, couldn't shake the memory of Karen's accusations. The words lingered in his mind, a constant reminder of the challenges he faced simply for being who he was. Between orders, he stole a glance at his reflection in the stainless steel of the kitchen equipment. His apron was splattered with sauces, his hands worked tirelessly, and his mind raced. He loved cooking. It was his passion, his escape, and his art. But moments like these made him question if the dream he was chasing was worth the cost of enduring such prejudice. As the night progressed, Mr. Williams kept a watchful eye on Elijah. He noticed the chef's movements were a little less fluid, his smile less frequent. It wasn't like Elijah to let the dining area affect his work. A new table of guests had arrived. The weight of Karen's words, a couple, was visible seemingly in their early 40s, scanned the menu with interest. Their conversation was light, their laughter genuine. What they didn't know was that they had just walked into the aftermath of a tense and emotional scene. Their server, Jasmine, a bubbly and empathetic young woman, approached them with a warm smile. She had been working at the restaurant long enough to see how much Elijah meant to the team. She couldn't help but feel protective of him after what had happened earlier. As Jasmine took their orders, the man in the couple asked, "We've heard a lot about your chef. Is he as good as they say?" "Oh, he's better," Jasmine replied without hesitation. "Elijah's one of the best. Every dish he makes tells a story, you know. You can taste the passion he puts into it." The couple nodded, clearly intrigued. Jasmine headed back to the kitchen with their order, her thoughts still on Elijah. She found him at the stove, focused but unusually quiet. "You good, chef?" she asked softly, setting the ticket on the counter. Elijah glanced at her, offering a faint smile. "Yeah, I'm good," he replied, though his tone lacked conviction. Jasmine frowned, wanting to say more, but she knew better than to push. Instead, she gave him an encouraging nod and went back to her tables. As the night wore on, the tension in Elijah's chest began to ease, thanks in part to the steady rhythm of the kitchen. Cooking had always been his way of finding peace, a way to channel his emotions into something tangible. But just when he thought he could push the events of the day to the back of his mind, a familiar voice rang out in the dining area. "I'd like to speak to the owner again." Elijah froze. His heart sank as he realized Karen had returned. The staff exchanged uneasy glances, and Jasmine, who was near the entrance, immediately walked over to intercept her. "Ma'am," Jasmine said, her voice polite but firm, "I think it's best if you leave. You caused quite a scene earlier, and we don't want any more disruptions." Karen, however, wasn't deterred. She crossed her arms and looked around the restaurant, as if searching for an audience. "I have every right to be here," she said loudly. "This is a public place, and I'm a paying customer. Or am I not welcome here either?" Jasmine's jaw tightened, but before she could respond, Mr. Williams appeared once again. He had been in his office, reviewing paperwork, but the commotion had drawn him out. "Ma'am," he said calmly, stepping between Karen and the dining area. "We've already addressed this matter. If you have no other business here, I'll have to ask you to leave." Karen's eyes flashed with indignation. "Oh, I see how it is," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're taking his side again. Typical." Mr. Williams raised an eyebrow. "I'm taking the side of truth and fairness," he said firmly. "Now, unless you'd like me to call security, I suggest you leave before you disturb our guests any further." Karen's face turned a deep shade of red, but she seemed to sense that she was outmatched. With a huff, she turned and stormed out once more, her exit as dramatic as her arrival. Elijah, watching from the kitchen, let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The knot in his stomach loosened slightly, but the weight of the day still lingered. Later that night, as the restaurant began to wind down, Mr. Williams approached Elijah. The two of them stood in the quiet kitchen, the hum of the refrigerators the only sound around them. "Elijah," Mr. Williams began, his voice gentle, "I know today wasn't easy, but I want you to know how proud I am of you. You handled everything with grace and dignity, even when you had every right to lose your temper." Elijah looked down at his hands, the same hands that had crafted countless meals and held countless dreams. "It's just hard, you know," he admitted. "I love what I do, but sometimes it feels like I'm fighting a battle I can't win." Mr. Williams nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I understand," he said. "But remember, you're not fighting this alone. You have a whole team here who believes in you, and more importantly, you believe in yourself. Don't let one person's ignorance define your worth." Elijah nodded, the words sinking in. It wasn't a solution, but it was enough to remind him why he had chosen this path in the first place. As the restaurant emptied out and the staff began cleaning up, Elijah took one last look at the kitchen. It wasn't just a workspace, it was his sanctuary, his canvas, his home. And as he locked up for the night, he made a silent vow to himself. No matter what challenges lay ahead, he wouldn't let anyone take this from him. The streets were quiet as Elijah walked home, the events of the day still playing in his mind. But for the first time in hours, he felt a glimmer of hope. This wasn't the end of his story, just another chapter, and he was determined to make the next one even better. The next morning, Elijah woke up early, determined to shake off the previous day's negativity. The sun was barely rising, casting a soft golden glow through his apartment window. He stood in the kitchen, a cup of coffee in his hands, and stared out at the quiet street below. He replayed Mr. Williams' words in his head, words of encouragement that had kept him grounded through the night. Still, a part of him couldn't let it go. Karen's actions had opened an old wound, one he thought had healed. But now, the doubts and insecurities crept back in, threatening to overshadow the pride he felt in his craft. He knew he couldn't let it win. When he arrived at the restaurant, the team greeted him warmly. Jasmine gave him a bright smile as she tied her apron. "Morning, chef. Ready to show everyone what you're made of today?" she asked cheerfully. Elijah chuckled softly, her optimism infectious. "Always," he replied, though the tension in his chest hadn't fully disappeared. The morning prep began as usual, but something felt different. Elijah noticed how the staff rallied around him, offering support in subtle ways. A kind word, an extra hand when things got busy. Even the kitchen had a buzz of determination, as if everyone was working harder to lift each other up. As the day unfolded, the restaurant saw a steady stream of customers. Word of Karen's outburst had spread, thanks to some diners who had been present and shared their experience online. But instead of negativity, the posts were filled with praise for Elijah and the way he had handled the situation with poise and dignity. By lunchtime, the restaurant was packed. Regulars and new customers alike came not just for the food, but to support Elijah. The energy in the room was electric, a stark contrast to the tension of the previous day. In the middle of the lunch rush, something unexpected happened. A young man, dressed casually but with an air of importance, entered the restaurant. He carried a camera and microphone, and behind him was a woman with a notepad. They introduced themselves as journalists from a local news outlet. "We heard about what happened here yesterday," the young man said, addressing Mr. Williams. "We'd like to do a feature on the restaurant and specifically on Chef Elijah. Would you be open to that?" Mr. Williams hesitated for a moment, glancing toward Elijah, who had been listening from the kitchen doorway. He could see the mixture of surprise and apprehension on Elijah's face. "It's up to you, Elijah," Mr. Williams said gently. "No pressure." Elijah wiped his hands on his apron, thinking quickly. He wasn't someone who sought the spotlight, but this felt different. This was an opportunity to tell his story, not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever been judged unfairly. After a moment, he nodded. "Let's do it," he said, his voice steady. The journalist spent the next hour interviewing Elijah, capturing footage of him working in the kitchen and talking to the staff and customers. His words heartfelt. They asked him about his journey. He talked about his love for food and how he had dealt with the challenges he faced growing up. He shared the struggles he faced as a black chef in an industry where he was often underestimated. And while he didn't dwell on Karen's actions, he used the moment to highlight the importance of perseverance and the support of a strong community. By the time the interview ended, Elijah felt a sense of relief. He had turned a painful moment into something meaningful, and that alone felt like a victory. But the day wasn't over yet. Just as the journalists were packing up their equipment, the restaurant door swung open, and Karen walked in. This time, she wasn't alone. She was accompanied by an older man, impeccably dressed and carrying an air of authority. The room went silent. Elijah's heart sank as he recognized the man, Karen's husband, a prominent local businessman who had connections that could make or break establishments like theirs. The tension in the room was palpable as Karen marched toward Mr. Williams, her husband trailing behind her. "This is the place I was telling you about," Karen said, her voice sharp. "They humiliated me yesterday, and I won't let it stand. You need to do something." Her husband looked around, taking in the crowded dining room and the watchful eyes of the customers. He seemed less certain than Karen, but his expression hardened as she continued her tirade. "I expect an apology," she said, glaring at Mr. Williams, "from you and from that so-called chef of yours." Mr. Williams stepped forward, his expression calm but unyielding. "With all due respect, ma'am," he said evenly, "you caused a scene yesterday that disrupted our business and disrespected a valued member of my team. If anyone deserves an apology, it's Elijah." Karen's face turned red, but before she could respond, her husband held up a hand. "Let's not make this worse," he said quietly, but firmly. Karen looked at him in disbelief. "You're taking their side," she hissed. "I'm taking the side of reason," he replied. Then, turning to Mr. Williams, he added, "My apologies for the disruption. We'll be leaving now." Karen looked like she was about to argue, but her husband gave her a look that silenced her. With one last glare, she turned and stormed out, her husband following close behind. As the door closed behind them, the room erupted in applause. The customers cheered, and the staff exchanged relieved smiles. Elijah stood in the kitchen, his heart pounding. He felt a surge of emotions, relief, pride, and an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the people who had stood by him. But even as the moment passed, he knew this wasn't the end. Karen's actions might be behind him, but the fight for respect and equality was far from over, and Elijah was ready to face it, one dish at a time. The applause slowly faded, and the restaurant returned to its bustling rhythm. But the adrenaline coursing through Elijah's veins didn't subside. He busied himself in the kitchen, trying to shake off the tension that Karen's unexpected return had reignited. Yet, even as he focused on his work, the unease lingered like a shadow, refusing to be ignored. By the time the lunch rush was over, Elijah finally allowed himself a moment to breathe. He leaned against the counter, sipping a glass of water as he watched the staff cleaning up and resetting tables. It seemed like the worst was behind them. But just as the team started to relax, the restaurant phone rang. Jasmine picked it up, her cheerful voice filling the room as she greeted the caller. Her expression shifted almost immediately, her smile faltering as her eyes darted toward the kitchen. "Chef," she called out, her voice hesitant. "It's for you." Elijah frowned, wiping his hands on his apron as he approached the phone. "Who is it?" he asked quietly. Jasmine shrugged, her face a mixture of confusion and concern. "They didn't say." Elijah took the receiver, his heart pounding. "This is Elijah," he said cautiously. There was a brief silence on the other end, followed by a voice he didn't recognize. It was deep, measured, and carried an unsettling calmness. "Chef Elijah," the man said. "I've heard a lot about you recently." Elijah's grip on the phone tightened. "Who is this?" "That's not important," the man replied. "What is important is your reputation. It seems you've garnered quite a bit of attention, some of it good, some of it less so." Elijah's stomach twisted. "If you have something to say, just say it," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. The man chuckled softly. "Let's just say I represent certain interests in this city, people who value order and discretion. The events of the past couple of days have stirred things up, and not everyone is pleased. My advice to you? Keep your head down and stick to cooking. Leave the rest alone." Before Elijah could respond, the line went dead. He stared at the phone, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. The cryptic warning sent a chill down his spine, and his mind raced with questions. Who was the caller? What did they mean by certain interests? And why was he being targeted? Jasmine watched him anxiously. "Chef, what's wrong?" Elijah shook his head, forcing a weak smile. "Nothing," he lied. "Just a weird call." But Jasmine wasn't convinced. "You sure? You look like you've seen a ghost." Elijah took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I'm fine," he said, more firmly this time. "Let's get back to work." Despite his attempt to brush it off, the phone call stayed with him for the rest of the day. It wasn't just the words, it was the tone, the underlying threat that made his skin crawl. As evening approached, Elijah decided to confide in Mr. Williams. He found the owner in his office, going over the day's receipts. "Got a minute?" Elijah asked, stepping inside. Mr. Williams looked up, immediately noticing the tension in Elijah's posture. "Of course," he said, setting his paperwork aside. "What's on your mind?" Elijah recounted the phone call, leaving out no detail. As he spoke, Mr. Williams' expression grew increasingly serious. "Whoever this is, they're trying to intimidate you," Mr. Williams said when Elijah finished. "But why? What do they have to gain from this?" Elijah shook his head. "I don't know. Maybe it's connected to Karen, or maybe it's something bigger. All I know is, it doesn't feel random." Mr. Williams leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he thought. "We need to be careful," he said finally. "If this person is connected to Karen or her husband, they might have influence. But that doesn't mean we back down. You've done nothing wrong, Elijah, and I won't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Elijah nodded, grateful for Mr. Williams' unwavering support, but as he left the office, the sense of foreboding remained. The next day brought another surprise. As Elijah arrived at the restaurant, he noticed a group of people gathered outside. They were holding signs with slogans like "Justice for All" and "Support Elijah," and their presence drew the attention of passers-by. At first, Elijah was taken aback. He hadn't expected such a public show of support, and while it warmed his heart, it also made him nervous. The increased visibility could provoke more backlash from whoever had made that phone call. Inside, the staff buzzed with excitement. Jasmine ran up to Elijah, practically bouncing with energy. "Did you see them? They're here for you, chef." Elijah managed a smile. "Yeah, I saw," he said. "It's overwhelming, but in a good way." Despite his mixed feelings, Elijah couldn't deny the encouragement he felt as the day went on. Customers came in, many of them mentioning the rally outside and expressing their support. It was a reminder that for every Karen in the world, there were countless others who believed in fairness and justice. But just as things seemed to be looking up, another twist emerged. Late in the afternoon, a delivery truck pulled up to the restaurant. The driver, a burly man with a clipboard, asked for Elijah. "These are for you," the driver said, gesturing towards several large boxes. Elijah frowned, puzzled. "I didn't order anything." The driver shrugged. "Doesn't matter. Your name's on the paperwork." Reluctantly, Elijah signed for the delivery and helped the driver bring the boxes inside. When he opened the first one, his heart sank. Inside was a pile of spoiled produce, rotting vegetables and fruits that emitted a rancid smell. A note was tucked among the mess, written in bold block letters. Asterisk asterisk stay in your lane asterisk asterisk. Elijah's hands clenched into fists. The phone call had been a warning, and now this. Whoever was behind it was escalating their intimidation tactics, and it was clear they weren't going to stop. As the staff gathered around, their expressions a mix of anger and concern, Mr. Williams stepped forward. "Enough is enough," he said firmly. "We're not letting whoever this is scare us. We'll report this to the authorities and make sure everyone knows the kind of behavior we're dealing with." Elijah nodded, his resolve hardening. The stakes had been raised, and the conflict had become personal. But he wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. Would you like to continue building the story toward its climax? The tension in the restaurant was palpable as Mr. Williams called the police to report the incident. While the spoiled produce was being cleared out, Elijah stood near the window, watching the protesters outside. Their chants of support filled the air, a stark contrast to the unease swirling within him. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. When the officers arrived, Elijah explained everything: Karen's initial outburst, the cryptic phone call, and now the delivery meant to intimidate him. The officers listened intently, taking notes and asking questions. They assured him they would investigate, but their words offered little comfort. Whoever was behind this clearly knew how to stay in the shadows. As the day went on, Elijah threw himself into his work, channeling his frustration into the dishes he prepared. The kitchen hummed with activity, the familiar rhythm a temporary escape from the chaos outside. But the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of his focus. Later that evening, as the dinner rush wound down, an unexpected visitor walked through the door. It was Karen's husband, the same man who had tried to smooth things over during her previous visit. He looked uneasy, his usually confident demeanor replaced by a hint of nervousness. Elijah stepped out from the kitchen, his heart pounding. The dining room fell silent as everyone turned to watch the interaction. "I need to speak with you," the man said, addressing both Elijah and Mr. Williams. His tone was measured, but there was a tension in his voice that set everyone on edge. Mr. Williams crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "You got our attention," he said. The man glanced around, clearly uncomfortable with the audience. "Can we talk privately?" Elijah hesitated, but Mr. Williams nodded. "Let's go to my office," he said, leading the way. Inside the office, the man closed the door behind him and took a deep breath. "I'm here to apologize," he began, his voice low. Elijah and Mr. Williams exchanged a skeptical glance. "My wife's behavior was unacceptable," the man continued. "I've already spoken to her about it, and well, let's just say she won't be causing any more trouble. But that's not why I'm here." Elijah frowned, crossing his arms. "Then why are you here?" The man hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. "There's something you need to know. The harassment you've been experiencing, it wasn't her idea." Elijah's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" The man ran a hand through his hair, visibly uncomfortable. "There are people in this city, powerful people, who don't like seeing someone like you succeed. They see your talent, your growing reputation, and they feel threatened. They're the ones who sent the produce, who made that call. My wife, she was just a pawn in their game." Elijah stared at him, the weight of the revelation sinking in. "Why are you telling us this?" "Because I don't agree with it," the man said firmly. "I may not have handled things perfectly, but I believe in fairness. And what they're doing to you, it's wrong. I thought you deserved to know." Before Elijah could respond, the door burst open. One of the servers stood there, her face pale. "Chef, you need to come outside. Now." Elijah and Mr. Williams rushed to the front of the restaurant, followed closely by Karen's husband. Outside, the scene was chaotic. The peaceful protest had turned into a confrontation. A group of men in dark suits stood at the edge of the crowd, their presence intimidating. One of them stepped forward, his sharp features illuminated by the streetlights. "Chef Elijah," he called out, his voice carrying over the noise. "We need to have a word." Elijah stepped outside, his heart pounding. The protesters fell silent, their eyes fixed on him. "What do you want?" Elijah asked, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. The man smirked. "We want you to understand your place. This little stunt of yours, bringing attention to yourself, stirring up trouble, it needs to stop. You're stepping on toes, and that's not good for business." Elijah clenched his fists, his anger bubbling to the surface. "All I've done is work hard and treat people with respect. If that threatens you, maybe you're the one who needs to rethink your place." The crowd erupted in cheers, their support bolstering Elijah's courage. The man's smirk faded, replaced by a scowl. "You're making a mistake," he warned. "This isn't over." Elijah took a step forward. As the man retreated, the crowd's cheers grew louder. "You're right." Elijah turned to face them, because I'm not backing down. A mixture of relief and determination washing over him. He had faced his fears, stood up to the intimidation, and come out stronger. But just as he began to feel a sense of closure, a voice rang out from the back of the crowd. "Elijah." He turned to see a woman pushing her way through, her face familiar yet unexpected. It was someone from his past, someone he hadn't seen in years. "Elijah," she repeated, her voice trembling. "It's me, your sister." The crowd fell silent once more as Elijah stared at her, his mind racing. He hadn't seen her since they were kids, separated by circumstances beyond their control. And now here she was, standing before him, a living reminder of everything he thought he'd lost. The twist left Elijah reeling, the conflicts of the past colliding with the challenges of the present. He had found his voice, his community, and now a piece of his family. But the road ahead was still uncertain, and the fight was far from over. Would you like to continue the story with the resolution of this new twist or explore additional layers?